Hello everybody, this is Fun Police. I am back again for now the second week of card reveals from the Legion expansion. Last time we took a look at the first week, which contained a total of 5 cards, but now we have seen that number practically double since then, as the devs released 2 cards a day, and due to a bit of a late recording, this is actually covering the Monday cards of this week also, so we get an extra 3. Due to that, we have significantly more to go over, which might make this either a bit longer of a video, but I'm going to also try to be a bit quicker in my thoughts over the different cards. Beyond that, how about we just jump into it? So the first card we're going to look at is going to be the first Gurkha Rifles. The first Gurkha Rifles is a British infantry. It is a special, and it costs 2 credits. Operates for 1 and is a 1/4 with the text Fury, and deployment gets +1 attack for each order you have given this turn. I think the first thing I think everybody thinks about is putting it into a commando deck. Commando decks are infamous for playing many cheap orders. Things like Cup of Tea, Naval Power, and just all sorts of things, which makes it a natural fit as a way to buff this up. It can very quickly become a pretty serious threat. Even just casting 1 or 2 orders is quite the powerful effect, able to make this, reasonably threatening. However, I also want to suggest maybe some different ideas. So another deck that actually happens to play a handful of cheap orders is actually British Air. With a card like Close Air Support, that Fury can potentially make this a very hard-hitting unit. And you still run things like Monty, and we also usually have cards like Air Superiority or similar cheap orders kicking around in the deck. That potentially could make it a very interesting card there as game-ending threat. That may be a bit less likely, but the option is there. There is also the idea of potentially fitting it into some sort of aggressive deck. It takes very little to get this into a playable state, as a 2/4 Fury for 2 credits or a 3/4 Fury is still quite well statted and means it could be quite the serious threat. There's also other ways to abuse the cheap access to Fury. There's not mainly buffing its attack. Maybe the Cruiser Mark III could be a part of that deck. Or maybe we just still lean into like Close Air Support, or for example, the US Unity is Strength, which also gives infantry. I think there's a lot of possibilities for this card, and we'll have to see what decks it fits into going forward. It's definitely an interesting card, but I think it has enough going for it that it could probably find a home somewhere. Next up, we have the B7A2 Ryusei. It is a Japanese limited bomber. It costs 2 credits, operates for 1, and has 2 attack and 1 health. It has the text Blitz, but it cannot attack the enemy HQ. So this effect is very reminiscent of a couple other cards we've seen in the game already, most notably the 28cm Coastal Howitzer, which is a 4/3 that cannot attack the enemy HQ. We have not seen a lot of that card recently. Decks have largely gone away from it, but it did see play in slower Japanese decks before, and I think the Ryusei is significantly better than most of these. For 3 credits, you're able to deal 2 damage to anything you want and leave a 2/1 bomber on the board. That is quite powerful, as we've seen with stuff like the German Nebelwerfer 42, which is a 2/2 artillery that deals 1 to something on the board. Cheap ways to deal damage to enemy units is quite the efficient card, and this, I think, fits that very well. I think this is a very easy card to slot in as like an early game tool for Japanese control decks. Currently, that mostly resides with Japan Resistance, which could definitely benefit from maybe just having a couple cheap ways to deal 2 damage, would help increase their anti-aggro. But even decks beyond, most Japan decks beyond that, could probably benefit from having a, relatively cheap way to deal damage. I think it's overall a pretty powerful card, and I'd be surprised if it doesn't see play somewhere at some point. Next up is the Ju-88G6. It is a German special card, special fighter. It is 5 credits, operates for 2 credits. It is a 4/6, and it has the text, when this unit destroys a unit, add a copy of the destroyed unit to your hand. This is a very interesting card, and we really haven't seen any effect like this, so it is a bit difficult to say how impactful it is. In Germany, the closest option is the Focke-Wulf 190A, which is a 6-credit 5/5 that draws a card on deployment. But probably the closest comparison is actually in the US with the P47 Thunderbolt, which is almost the exact same card, but it has -1 attack for drawing a card. I think overall, the Ju-88 is an interesting card, but I have trouble seeing it as a serious card. It's meant to be seemingly some sort of value, but I have a hard time seeing why I would run it over something like the Focke-Wulf 190. The conditions have to be very favorable in order to steal something worthwhile, or you have to somehow give it blitz, which is not the easiest of tasks. And I think that really hurts the Ju-88 in terms of competitive viability. It is a very fun card, and there definitely are going to be some funny highlights when someone steals that B17 or some massive value unit with it and just completely overruns the enemy with their own cards. But I think that is more of a for fun card than an actual serious card. It's just a bit too vanilla, I think, to really see competitive play, at least. Following that, we have the Soviet Red Dawn. It is a Soviet standard order. It costs 1 credit and has the text, choose one, deal 3 damage to a unit and your HQ, or add from the people to your hand. Now, for those that maybe are trying to remember what from the people is, that is the Soviet 3-credit order that says deal 3 damage to a unit. That is a very basic card, but Red Dawn brings it into, I think, a very interesting position. Compared to a lot of Soviet orders, like Bloody Sickle, which is a very standard Soviet card, almost ubiquitous, it is definitely trading a lot more health for that early damage. However, the Soviets also do have ways to benefit from that self-damage. Probably the most standout being the new 34th Guards, which get cheaper as you play damage units. And we haven't seen a self-damage deck completely take off yet, but I think Red Dawn most naturally fits into that deck. Although I could potentially see it in also a couple other decks, such as some very health gain heavy decks. If you can find a deck that plays a lot of health gain to where you can shrug off that early 3 damage, that could essentially become a 1 credit deal 3 damage to a unit, which is actually very powerful. And it's important to note that this card is also incredibly flexible. Red Dawn being able to... It has a version of itself that doesn't require you to take damage. Now, granted, paying 4 credits for From the People is not the greatest deal in the world, but I think it's much better because you get to choose if you can pay for a super cheap removal that hurts you, or just get a From the People at a bit of a premium. I think that is not only interesting in terms of how you want to build and play the card, but it also, I think, gives this card a lot of chances to see play. If you can somehow mitigate the damage, for example, with the U.S. infantry the 8th Cavalry Regiment. That could be potentially quite the interesting effect, being able to just have a 1 credit deal 3. That may be a bit of a more meme strategy right now, but there is some there. Or if you just have, again, a lot of healing or anything like that, it could give Red Dawn, I think, a good home in a couple different decks. Beyond that, we have a US card coming next, the PB4Y-2 Privateer. It is a special bomber for the US again, and it costs 5 credits, operates for 2 credits, and has 4 worth of stats. It also has the text Heavy Armor 1, and the text, it costs the enemy 2 credits to target or attack this unit. So to clarify what this means is that any order or anything that the enemy has to target, will make them pay an additional 2. So units attacking, units with their deployment effects, units or orders that make you target all cost this. Stuff that doesn't target, for example, something like Death from Above or Carpet Bombing, they don't specifically target and will not pay more for it. I see the Privateer as actually a really good US mid-range card. This effect seems incredible at making it just really hard to interact with your units in the early game or in the mid game. I see it similar to the M4A1 in terms of this effect being difficult to remove and really requiring you to work for it. Especially if you want to try to attack into the PBY or the PB4, it is going to cost you a lot of credits to remove it, and that is quite powerful. Taxing the enemy is a theme we've seen in a variety of cards, like the P40N5. The fact that it's not as ubiquitous as the P40, I think, is the big thing that keeps it from being too overwhelming, but I definitely think that it is going to fit into any mid-range US strategies. For example, the ones like Bolster the Ranks, which are able to really benefit from having good mid-range threats. Bolster's not a bad target on this. You make it a 6/6 Bomberator operating for free, and if the enemy wants to deal with it, they're going to have to spend extra credits to do so. That could be quite a powerful synergy. Or you can even just run it as a good threat in some sort of deck. Currently, US midrange isn't that popular of a deck list, but I think the PB4Y is definitely going to be a big assistance to that deck. Following that up, we have the 1st Texas Infantry. It is a US limited infantry. It is 3 credits. It operates for 2 credits. It is a 1/1, and it has the text doubled attack and defense when you gain an extra credit slot. So an extra credit slot refers specifically to things like War Machine, which says gain 1 extra credit slot, or something such as War Bonds. Gaining credits naturally on your turn is not the same thing. So you do have to play this in a ramp deck, as those are the decks most commonly playing this. And it's hard to say. This card is definitely, I think, pretty solidly a meme card. There's a lot of work you have to get into this, and it does grow very quickly. If you can ramp maybe 2 or 3 times, it gets very big very quickly. Or if you can apply some buffs onto this, notably the USAS, giving it +1/+1 for 0 credits could potentially allow you to very quickly spiral it out of control. But that is, I think, more of a meme than anything. I think Texas Infantry is going to be, a fun card to mess around with, but I think when it comes to seriously building decks, it's just too slow for too much work compared to most other things ramp decks can be doing. Even on a budget, I don't really see it. I think it's mostly a meme card. But hey, it's a fun meme card. Then we move on to the Soviets with a special. It is a special infantry, the 125th Rifle Regiment. It costs 4 credits, operates for 1, and is a 3/4 with the text guard, and when the enemy draws a card, deal 1 damage to the enemy HQ. So this is instantly reminiscent of the KV-1 1941, which is essentially the big version of this, and is quite the powerful card in its own regard. Even though it doesn't have guard, it is very tough to remove and seriously punishes the enemy for drawing cards. So the 125th is helping the Soviets to have more redundancy in that effect of punishing the enemy for drawing cards, which is an interesting thing. It also has guard, so it has uses against like aggressive decks. The 1 damage is definitely a little bit less impactful, but I think there is the potential to make the 125th quite powerful. In the right deck, this could be really annoying to deal with. Being able to wear you down without ever moving, while also not needing to move it or operate it means that the enemy is going to have to spend time dealing with that while you continue to develop a board or apply pressure in some other way, or even just, protect it with like countermeasures or something. We'll have to see. I don't know if Soviet Value will be interested in this specifically. There's a lot of healing going around right now, so this 1 damage might be too insignificant. We'll have to see if there's like any more effects like this, or if there's something that we haven't seen yet that would tie into this. If there isn't, I think it is definitely a card to keep an eye on, but I don't know if it'll fit into decks that are currently out there. Even Soviet Value might not want this, mainly because they might run out of room in favor of other cards. But definitely something to keep an eye on for the future, especially if we get maybe more effects like this. Next up, we have the Japanese Kika. It is a elite fighter. It is 7 credits and operates for 3. It is a 6/5, and it has Blitz. Alongside Destruction, shuffle 4 Kamikaze into your deck. Kamikaze, for those that may be unaware or aren't able to remember it, is the card gotten from Last Rites, which is a 1 credit, deal 1 damage to the enemy HQ, draw a card. The Kika does a very similar thing, but potentially changes up how you play that. You're getting the less Kamikaze overall, but you do get 6 attack on a Blitz plane up front. So it has, I think, some very interesting suggestions for slower Japanese decks. The big thing is that it's adding redundancy. You now have 2 cards shuffling Kamikazes into your deck, which is quite useful. It raises the damage ceiling of those Japanese decks quite a lot. Especially when you start combining them with stuff like the Sairan or the Kawanishi, which are able to boost damage orders. You get the additional 4 Kamikazes could potentially be quite a lot of damage. And of course, the Kika itself dealing 6, means that there's potentially a lot more damage that the Japanese control decks can pump out, which is definitely a good thing, especially in such a heal-heavy meta. And if that heal meta is ever changed or the healing becomes a little less, it could become quite the powerful deck with its own mass healing. The Kika, I don't think the Kika will fit into decks that aren't, already playing like Last Rites. Maybe if there's a control deck out there that just needs like damage but doesn't want Last Rites for some reason, the Kika would be a good choice. But I think overall, this is mainly just an inclusion for the order boost damage decks, namely the ones with the Japan-France resistance decks. That seems like definitely the place it'll fit in the best. And then after that, it's a bit hard to see where it goes. But it's definitely a very good card and seems very likely to fit itself nicely into that list. Now we have the new mechanic of exile. So this is a mechanic we're going to see for Poland. the new minor nation. Exile as a keyword is largely going to be a deck building effect. Essentially, any card with exile is paired with one other nation and is able to get access, which allows it to be used in either any deck with Poland or with that exile nation. So let's, as a quick example, let's take a look at the first card, the T3476 Polish, or PL. It has exile. Now, just to clarify, we will know what exile it is in game. When you look at the tooltip, it'll let you know. But right now, it just, on the card at least, it only says exile. So we'll have to look in game to know. But most of these should be pretty obvious. Like the T-34, it's a Soviet exile. But what this means is that I can play this T-34 in any deck that I have Poland as an ally, or any deck that has the Soviets as the main or ally nation. So these cards, what that means overall is that exile cards are going to be fantastic budget cards for one. Being able to essentially craft a card that goes into two different nations is just great for budget players. Those wild cards, essentially are worth double, if you play this card in a deck. So that's really nice. And to clarify a little bit more, since I know there's going to be some other questions about it, exile also, if you play it in a Soviet and Polish deck, it'll count as a Soviet card first, I believe. Assuming that is how it works, that is, I believe, how it works, and that should definitely help to keep the T-34, or, lets you kind of actually play with 16 Polish cards, as an example, in a Soviet-Polish deck, as you can play the 4 T-34 Polish versions, and then also 12 other non-exile cards. So that's quite interesting. In terms of the T-34 itself, it is a standard tank. It is 4 credits and operates for 2 for a 4/4 with the aforementioned exile, and then it also has Blitz and Heavy Armor 1. This card is very similar to some of the other cards, a couple other cards we've seen in game. Most notably, the German Panzer IIIJ is the closest we've seen. That one is just a 4/5 Blitz, so there's definitely a bit of difference. But I would expect the T-34 to probably be in and around that power level. It might be a little bit better due to that heavy armor, but otherwise I think this is going to mostly be a budget card. It's just not that strong, at least to what we know right now. The T-34 just overall offers, it's going to be, I think, a great budget card. The regular T-34, the 5-credit 5/5 with Blitz, is a great budget card, and I think this being one cheaper, but also having that exile and heavy armor makes this just like an amazing budget card. So if you're a new player and you're looking to spend or get some cards from Legion, I think this is going to be one of your better options, at least based on the current amount of reveals. But otherwise, I would probably not expect this to see much play. It's just, unless there's like something with like exile or maybe something with heavy armor, which we'll talk about in a couple cards. But even with that, I don't think this is strong enough right now to see play. But maybe there's something we haven't seen, or there's some synergy I'm not thinking of that would make this worthwhile to play. The next card, the other exile card we saw, was the Spitfire Mark V PL. It is a limited fighter. It costs 6 credits. It operates for 2. And it is a 5/6 with exile and a deployment effect to give a friendly infantry +1/+1 and guard. So this is very similar to the British Spitfire Mark V, where it trades away one attack in favor of that deployment effect and kind of the exile. So the question comes down to which one of these would we probably run, and I would say the Polish version is probably the more powerful version, even if unless you're running no infantry, but that is highly unlikely in a deck with Spitfires due to the fact that you're going to be running the RAF ground crew. But I think overall the Polish Spitfire is going to be a much more effective card, and it's going to just be very useful in a Spitfire deck. Those decks often struggle with Spitfires being slow, so being able to put out being able to make something into a guard, gives you just that kind of moment of breather while you get down your big fighters. I think that is definitely like the biggest takeaway from this. Beyond that, I don't know I don't think the Spitfire will see much play outside of an actual Spitfire deck. It's just a little bit too bland of an effect. And most infantry played right now already has guard built on it, or it's so small that the guard will essentially mean nothing because it dies in like one attack or only has a couple points of health. So I think this will probably replace the standard Mark V in the Spitfire deck, but it's not that big of an upgrade, and overall it's kind of a okay card. If Spitfires are ever viable, I definitely expect this to be one of the more powerful Spitfires, though. But we'll need to see if there's more, or if that happens, which I don't think it will right now. Next up, we have the 4E Brigade for France. It is a standard rarity infantry. It is 3 credits. It operates for 1, and it is a 2/5 that has the deployment gets +1 attack for each non-French unit you control. So this card is interesting, but it also is really bad. This card is going to take a lot of work in order to make it practically a vanilla card. Just for reference, the 30th Regiment in the U.S. is a 4/4 for 3 credits with an operation cost of 1, and it has no text, requiring no work. So in order to make the 4E Regiment comparable, you have to have another unit on board to make it a 3/5, which is the same as that card in terms of its stat distribution. But mind you, the 30th Regiment sees absolutely 0 play. It's a starter card, so this has a requirement to become that. If you have 2 units on the board, it becomes a 4/5, which is still not very good. That's essentially like the actual vanilla standard. And then if you have 3 or more, that is when this card maybe starts getting good. But I don't know a deck that is able, I don't see any deck that is running France and also trying to have that many units on the board. I guess Soviet tokens, but that seems overall kind of just bad, to be honest. I don't want to hate on any card, but I definitely think this card is just kind of unredeemable. Even on a budget or for new players or in a meme deck, I don't see it. Maybe the French special has something to do with it, or maybe this is like the start of a theme we're going to see, and we're going to see like French cards in the future do something like this, and then it'll make sense. But for right now, this card just isn't good, sadly. The next card, however, is something that's a bit more interesting. It is another Polish card, this one also with exile. It is the IL-2M, Polish. It is a limited bomber, costs 4 credits. It operates for 2 credits. It is a 3/3 with exile, and by the way, this is a Soviet exile, and I should have mentioned that the Spitfire was a British exile, but hopefully that was easy enough to tell. But getting back to the IL-2, it has Soviet exile, and it has heavy armor 1, and the text, when a friendly unit with heavy armor survives combat, give it +1/+1. So this is another mechanic we're seeing in Poland, which is the survives combat effect. Survives combat is a kind of, it needs to be defined, and what survive combat means is that this unit was either attacked by or attacked another enemy unit and lived. That is, it does not count when when something attacks the enemy HQ, and it does not count, it doesn't count if it attacks the enemy HQ, and obviously if it dies, the effect won't trigger. But it just has to be unit-on-unit combat, and it doesn't matter how that combat works. For example, this being a bomber, if it attacks an enemy unit, it's going to get, the effect would trigger as it is as that counted as surviving combat. So, it doesn't have to take damage. It doesn't have to even deal damage, to be honest. All it has to do is just be in a combat with another unit and not die. So, getting beyond that, this is like a heavy armor tribal, which is something we have seen very little support for. But I think there is one card that many people immediately thought of when they saw this card work with heavy armor, and that is the Soviet special Men of Steel, which is able to give all of your units heavy armor, just for 1 credit. This means that combined with the IL-2, that could be, potentially an entire board constantly being buffed over and over again, while also having heavy armor to make it easier to combat. The Soviets also have a good amount of heavy armor on their own. Stuff like the T-34-85, the KV-1s, the armored train, or even getting really up here like the IS-2 or the ISU-152. Going beyond that nation, you also have stuff like the Germans, who have their Panthers, Tigers, and the cheap Stug 3G Skrucian. I know I butchered that, apologies. Which has Pincer to give heavy armor. Or we have, for example, a couple things in Britain, or even the US, who actually has a good amount of heavy armor bombers they can try to make use of. But it definitely seems like the Soviets would have the most synergy overall with this card, which makes sense as it is in a Soviet exile. But I think in terms of compatibility, the IL-2 is going to fall short, sadly, like most of the exile cards. It is able to grow itself, which is interesting. This means that it could potentially become quite the powerful card in itself, but it just overall is a bit too slow. At 4 credits, it's just a lot of work, and if you're trying to do Men of Steel combos, that's a lot of work for the buff. So I think it is a bit weak right now, but maybe this means we're going to get a heavy armor theme. We did see that with the Polish T-34, that it is, it has heavy armor, so maybe there's a theme there with the Soviets or the Polish. But at least right now, I don't see the IL-2 making many waves in competitive. But maybe there's a budget deck out there. I'm very interested to try it at least. It being, combining with that T-34 and Men of Steel, there could be a very fun meme deck around there. Or even you could just use it in a bomber deck. Or a artillery deck, and buff all your artillery over and over again. So I definitely think it's going to be a very fun card at the very least, but I just have a hard time seeing it as a competitive card unless we see something that really pushes a heavy armor theme. Then, moving on from that card, we have our first Italian card, the Canon DA47. It is a standard artillery piece. It costs 1 credit and operates for 1, and has 1/3 in stats, and has the text, is dealt 1 damage at the end of your turn unless you control more units than the enemy. Big thing to note is that this is more units. This does not, you can't, if you have an equal amount of units as the enemy, this will take damage. So this card is by far the best statted artillery we've seen at a 1 credit slot. It isn't even close. The only other artillery pieces we've really seen at 1 credits are 1/1s with minor effects. In fact, this stat line is comparable to some basic 2-drops, such as like the T-19 Howitzer or Type 88 AA gun. So the Canon is potentially very powerful, and there are a number of decks that could actually benefit from such a well-statted cheap artillery. Currently, we do see a powerful effect with the Soviets with stuff like Patriotic Firestorm, which is able to buff the artillery cheaply, or the US with their M8 Greyhounds. These are very easy and very cheap synergies that could potentially make the DA47 really powerful very quickly. For little work, it's definitely a card that really wants you to be ahead, so you can always have that extra health and not be losing health on this. But it is hard to say if a deck like that will materialize, as currently the artillery decks are mainly Soviet US and rely on the draw engine of a war production supply chain in order to continue their assaults. So Italy's going to have to either pick up that slack, or we're going to need to see some card draw in order to make this worthwhile. But I definitely think this is a very interesting card, and I'm interested to see, can it actually push out the U.S.? Can it shake up the U.S.-Soviet artillery meta? Or is this going to just be a card that is just not strong enough? It's very interesting. But beyond that, we have our 4th and final Polish card for today, the PZL P7. It is a Polish fighter that is standard in rarity. It costs 1 credit and operates for 1 also. It is a 1/2 with the Blitz text, and it has Blitz, and it also has when an enemy unit moves into the front line, retreat this unit. So this is really interesting. The most notable thing I think about this card is that this is one of the very few. This is the only 1 credit Blitz fighter within the game. In fact, it is one of the very few 1 credit Blitz units in the game. The only other ones that can really come to mind are stuff like 15th Cavalry and the Bicycle Regiments from Japan. But this P7 is a fighter, meaning it doesn't even have to move out of the back line in order to attack, and can immediately hit the enemy HQ. Similar to the DA47 we just talked about, it is actually potentially very powerful as an aggro card. You can play, it's pretty easy to play 2 or even 3 of these down, play a couple Patriotic Firestorms, and smack the enemy for, 9, 12 damage, for, only a handful of credits. It's a great amplifier in backline decks, and it's hard to say with so few Polish cards revealed so far, but if we see like more cheap Blitz, or if they have artillery, or if they have, anything that continues to support this, they could make a very strong backup ally or backline ally just by having this card make it Blitz. On top of that, it also retreats if the enemy tries to move into the front line to kill it, which seems like a downside, but I actually think is an upside, as you can play this early and, help use it to attack the enemy HQ. And if the enemy ever takes the front line, you get it back in hand and can then just save it for, when you need to do some extra burst with it. So I think this is actually a very strong card, and we'll just have to see if there's enough support around it. But I think this is just, very interesting. And, as a Polish card, if this is a theme or if, it just depends, But if there's more aggressive Polish cards, I could really see this being like a cornerstone of that archetype. So that's exciting. And then let's move on to the final card. We've been going for long enough now. The 28 Jager Regiment. It is a German limited infantry. It is a 1 credit that operates for 1. It is a 2/1, and it has the text smokescreen and gains ambush when it moves into the front line. So the 28th Jager is notably probably the first playable German infantry that costs 1 credit. The other options we've seen so far are stuff like the 1st Infantry Regiment, 4th Pioneer Battalion, and 56th Jager. And although the 56th Jager is not awful, it's also not particularly powerful. But I think the 28 Jager is actually very good. On its own, it may seem a bit underwhelming, but in the context of aggressive German decks, there's one card that makes this, I think, just a standout addition to many decks, and that's the Panzer 35T. This card, operates for free if you control an infantry unit. And up until this point, Germany has almost relied entirely on allied nations in order to be able to activate this reliably on turn 2. Whether that's Japan with the 15th Cavalry and its other numerous 1-drops, or the US with its 2/1 that for 1 credit, let me find the name real quick, the 32nd Infantry Regiment, or the 109th. Germany now is able to run its own 1-drop in the main nation. So this could potentially save precious allied slots in favor of something else. Smokescreen means that the enemy can't easily attack this. They'll have to either burn an order or just let it sit there until you find the moment is right. And that ambush is not going to be that impactful against slower decks, but could be massive against controlled or against other aggro decks. For example, Jagro is playing almost exclusively units that have 1 or 2 health, and this guy with ambush will just lock down the front line, and the enemy is going to have to run several cards into it or find one of their very few effects like Desperate Measures or Bombing Raid to remove it, and this is just a 1 credit card. I think this is potentially going to become kind of a staple of German aggressive decks, because of its synergy with the Panzer 35 and the occasional times where it's able to just stomp out other aggro decks and just lock down the board. So, interesting card. And with that, we are at the end of this video. Significantly longer than last time, by several orders. But that's because the devs have ramped up the reveals massively. I'm probably not going to wait as long as I did between these, as it seems like the devs are ramping it up even faster as we get closer to Legion. So I think we've seen the first of Poland, and that's incredibly interesting. The exile mechanic seems cool, and the other card we've seen is definitely quite powerful, or could potentially be quite powerful in aggro. And every nation seems to be getting a good, healthy mix of cards that are going to help improve decks in various ways. And so far, nothing looks that overbearing, which I think is a great thing. Legion is hopefully going to end up as a very balanced and, impactful but yet not broken expansion. I'm very excited. We'll see what the future holds, but that's going to be it for now. If you liked this video, like, comment, and subscribe. All of that helps grow my channel, which, we're still kind of in the grassroots start, but even just the few that have left comments, I've really appreciated. It's good to hear that people are enjoying this. Thank you and goodbye.